It's a string of webinars hosted by Ahmedabad University. And this is a way for us to bring interdisciplinary conversations with academics, thought leaders, policymakers, practitioners on various topics. And today's topic is very important, like many of our topics, because as we know, the discourse on the British Raj and the freedom struggle has disproportionately focused on the nationalist movement and the Congress and the freedom struggle led by the Congress leaders. And many other events and players were sidelined as sideshows to this main struggle. But one group of people who certainly do not deserve to be sidelined as a sideshow were the rulers of the princely states. Very often these Maharajahs of hundreds of kingdoms, big and small, scattered around the subcontinent, were labeled as despots and as imperial stooges or as puppets or as clowns, sometimes interested in elephants and palaces and Rolls Royces and so on, and not in the welfare of their populace, which is very far from the truth, as our speaker today will tell us. These stereotypes, like all stereotypes, are not true, and our speaker today has delved very deeply into that to understand the nuances, which we didn't do in our poll question, but to understand the nuances of the princely states and what they brought to the nationalist movement in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So with that, let me introduce our guests, who doesn't need an introduction really, but a very short introduction to Manu Pillai. Welcome, Manu, and thanks for joining us. Manu is what I would call a rock star historian. He's one of those young, the new generation of historians that have made history fun again. History, I can say from my personal experience, when I was a student several decades ago, I was put off history for life by the boring style in which history was taught and the boring textbooks that I was forced to read. But I have, after 4 decades, rekindled my love for history because of rock star historians who write in a narrative style that laymen like me can understand. So Manu Pillai and many of you will be familiar with other such historians like Anirudh Kanisetti or Ira Mukhoti and many historians who are bringing history to life again and taking it out of the dusty bookshelves of academics and bringing it into the real world. So Manu is one of them. He brings history to the common man. The history, the way it was taught to me, and probably still taught the way in many places, where when I look at course outlines, they have reading lists that have Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press and other university presses written all over them. And there is not a single book that invites wider readership. So Manu and other young historians are changing that. He is definitely a scholar, a serious scholar of history, but he does not wear history, his scholarship on his sleeves. He brings history to life in a narrative format that you and I can understand. He doesn't flaunt the scholarship. The book reads like a racy piece of fiction, but there is a huge amount of scholarship hidden behind that. So Manu's profile is very interesting. He's written several books, most recent of them being False Allies. And before that, many of you would have seen or read The Ivory Throne and other books. Manu was the chief of staff of Shashi Tharoor for a while. Thankfully, he did not take to Shashi's erudite English language. And so we can understand Manu far better than many of us can understand Shashi Tharoor. And for that, we are thankful. Manu is the winner of Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2017. He writes, other than his books, He writes in several popular publications, including Mint Lounge, The Hindu, the Hindustan Times, New Statesman, and so on. So Manu, welcome again. And Manu will be in conversation with Professor Tana Trivedi, who again, for most of us, doesn't need an introduction. Tana is the professor of communication and business history at Ahmedabad University. She is a postgraduate in English literature from St. Xavier's College. She completed her MLit in post-colonial diaspora from University of Stirling in the UK. She then completed her PhD from the Christ University in Bangalore. And before joining Ahmedabad University, she was teaching at Christ University, and she's taught at several other places and courses around business history, science journalism, diaspora studies, post-colonial studies, world literature, British literature, and so on. So I will now get out of the way, and over to you, Tana.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for the introduction. And yes, welcome, Manu, to this conversation. Very grateful to you. I know you were extremely busy, and yet you've joined us today. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right. So, I'll really like to begin where Professor Miglani kind of left off, and he really opened the question, saying that, we have a very elaborate history of the princely states, and yet we find very sketchy descriptions of the Maharajahs and their lifestyles. And we also then find descriptions about them when we look at, when we read history about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, bringing them all together during the, the formation of the nation. And this is conventional history. But really, I think we should begin by really asking, saying, who were these princely states? Who were these Maharajahs? And a good place, I think, to begin would be really to see if we can define what we mean by a princely state. So I really don't want to spend a lot of time talking. I want to hear more from you. So I'm just going to get you to tell us where we must begin when we start looking at the idea of a princely state.
That's a great question to start with, because there's, sort of conceptual complication when we use the term princely states, because the British basically lumped together about 565 states. And it's interesting because the number keeps changing depending on the year or the report that you look at. Sometimes Absolutely. They say it's 700 princely states, sometimes it's 565, sometimes it's 562. I think in the book I've written, I've chosen 562 because that's the record I cite. But the number keeps shifting, precisely because there was no clear definition of this. There were these chotu-motu zamindars, a number of them in Kathiawar, for example, hundreds of them, who ruled over, probably 100 acres odd, and then they were lumped as princes. But there was also the Nizam of Hyderabad, the last representative of the Mughal emperor, somebody who could marry into the Ottoman royal family and so on, who was in a completely different league. He had plans to even buy Goa from the Portuguese and use that as an access to the sea. That's in a completely different league. So then if you talk about the princely states and you talk about Rajas and kings and sovereignty in a meaningful way, and you apply a certain filter to define what is a state and what is perhaps a zamindari, you discover that they were about 100 or 120 states. Which were, they were earmarked as such because they had reasonable populations, they had reasonable revenue figures, and so on and so forth, and area. If you say, for example, have 1,000 square miles of territory, then perhaps if you cross 1,000 square miles, you can be considered a princely state. If you're under 1,000 square miles, perhaps you're something else, a different category. Now, there was a little bit of mischief on the part of the British in lumping all these people together, precisely because it made every Raja look like he was some, chotu-motu person here and there. You throw a stone, you hit a Raja. That's the analogy I like to often use.
Absolutely.
Because it was meant to sort of, in a sense, belittle them also, to make it look like, they weren't all that important. All the same, they were in fact important. The British needed the Rajas for their own legitimacy. Every time we read about the Delhi Darbar of 1911 or the Delhi Darbar of 1903, or the one in 1877 where Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress, it wasn't that the British could just issue orders saying Queen Victoria's Empress, everybody take note. No, they had to get all the princes in line. They had to get them to do processions, come to this Darbar and physically hear the news. because
Right.
only then would Indian society consider that news legitimate. By getting traditional leaders of Indian society to come and stand in front of the viceroy, to bow before the portrait of the queen and so on, and accept medals with the queen's profile on it, they were making a statement and they were seeking legitimacy, partly borrowing Mughal court ritual, but also using the Rajas for their own credentials in India. So the princely states were these enclaves that existed in India. They survived direct annexation from the British, and for various reasons, sometimes purely by accident. In the East India Company was not some kind of well-oiled machine where London took a decision and it was implemented exactly like that in India. Different governors general had different attitudes. One might be an expansionist like Lord Wellesley. Somebody like Cornwallis might be a little more hesitant. So sometimes, depending on who was in charge, the attitude of the company changed. So even if, like in the case of Travancore, which was the subject of my first book, they were lucky that when they had a rebellion against the company, etc., it was at a time when Lord Minto was the viceroy or the governor general, and he was not keen to annex. Whereas if it had happened a few years earlier with Wellesley in charge, he would have immediately annexed.
Right.
So these are the enclaves that managed to survive, and they managed to survive all the way till 1949. Not 1947, as people think, actually 2 years later, when the states were integrated into the Indian Union. Till then, they were legal entities, they were sovereign entities, even though their sovereignty was divided, in the sense that they did not possess complete sovereignty, but they were still considered sovereign enough to be called states and to have the capacity to negotiate with the British and later with the Indian Union. So that's a slightly long-winded. I don't know if it's a very neat answer.
No, absolutely.
Long-winded.
No, so, there was something about the gun salute also, which is very important, because I was reading an account where, there was somebody who had written in the vernacular in the regional, one of the Gujarati journals, saying the Britishers have given us the idea of a gun salute and have divided the states along those lines. And really, is that justified? On what basis are you giving us a gun salute? So yes, what you explained, absolutely kind of made sense. And so in that sense, even when you said that the number of princely states, you do find the number differing in several texts. You don't really, in fact, that also tells you about how large really the scope is of looking at the idea of a princely state. And of course, given that, my next question to you would be that, despite the existence of so many smaller states, princely states, they still do not find a mention in the conventional historical narratives of the Indian subcontinent. In a sense, when we look at the conventional history textbooks, which most of us read while growing up, we find the mention of princely states really in passing, or maybe the mention of of a few large princely states. But to say that really there existed so many different princely states, do you think it is important that we must engage with it? And why is it that we still haven't been able to incorporate that kind of history into the conventional narrative?
I think one of the reasons is that, once we got our freedom in 1947, there was a kind of nationalist narrative that was there. And all national narratives, regardless of where it is in the world, they have a very clear, almost romanticized idea, right? So you have the Mughal Empire, it collapses. There's a dark 18th century. The East India Company takes advantage, divide and rule, conquers the country. And then the Congress party emerges and they sort of fight for independence. And under Gandhiji's leadership, we achieve independence, which means the drama really in this narrative is happening only in British ruled India. And, partly also because a few years after independence, the ruling party, the Congress party, which was very dominant in those days, took what we famously call the socialist turn under Indira Gandhi in the late 60s. Again, the idea that the Rajas were just people who sold out the nation, although there was no nation then, but never mind, they sold out the nation. They were people who sided with the British. They were just useless people who hung around in big Havelis, oppressing people for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That kind of narrative was again sort of popularized. And to be fair, many of the Rajas, I think, indirectly contributed to it simply because after power was gone, what was left? Ritual, palaces, many of them turned into hotels, tourist brochures. So they also played up the romantic, the colorful, the kind of, attractive features of of glossy magazines and so on, instead of focusing more seriously on what was happening in their respective states. In terms of why these states are important, it's a very simple answer, because they give you such diverse and varied glimpses of India's cultural experience as a whole. Firstly, look at these Rajas. If you take a state like Pudukkottai, the Raja is a Kallar. Kallars were a so-called criminal tribe under the British. They were not Kshatriyas, they were not high-born kings or whatever. They belonged to what the British called a criminal tribe of robbers, a robber caste. You take Holkar of Indore, he was a Dhangar. Dhangars are basically the shepherd caste. The Marathas and the Rajputs constantly had this little upmanship going on, because the Rajputs called themselves good Kshatriyas and they looked down on the Marathas. And the Marathas sometimes aspired to that equal status with the Rajputs. In Kerala, you have a matrilineal, two princely states who are matrilineal, who couldn't intermarry with any of the other princely states that existed. You have something else happening in the Northeast, you have something else happening in Gujarat. So even the composition of these states tells us something about who could wield power in India. And it breaks down some of the cliches about, oh, power means Kshatriya king only. No, it complicates some of those questions. Secondly, it complicates issues around identity also, right? So you're sitting in Gujarat at the moment. The Gaikwads of Baroda who came and ruled Baroda state, large chunks of Gujarat, they were a Maratha royal family. And even in the late 19th century, a lot of Gujarati subjects of their own looked at them as foreigners. So in the colonial period, the idea of the foreigner wasn't just the East India Company. There were many who looked at fellow Indians of different languages, of different color, of different cultural backgrounds as equally foreign. You find, for example, in South Indian courts in the late 19th century, a huge bureaucratic service caste emerged of the Maharashtrian Deshastha Brahmins. You find them in the Tamil courts, you find them in Kerala, you find them in Hyderabad, you find them in the British service. They were, in a sense, the backbone of the East India Company, who helped man the East India Company's bureaucracy and the princely states. But look at how they are described in the princely states. In Pudukkottai and Travancore, foreigners. They're called foreign Brahmins who come and rule. So again, the idea of identity becomes slightly more complicated when we look at the princely states. Finally, the emergence of nationalism. Rahul Sagar, who's working on a wonderful book on Sir T. Madhav Rao, he talks about how one of the first draft constitutions in India was prepared for a princely state. A lot of conversations around nationalism originally emerged in the princely states, because princely states were the only bits of India that was still 40% of India that was still governed by Indians with Indian ministers for Indian subjects. The British may exist as a kind of suzerain layer on top, but even so, here within the princely states, it was still Indians in charge of their own destiny, which is why a lot of the early nationalists like Ranade, Dadabhai Nauroji, all of them felt that if we actually champion the princely states and help the princely states govern at a new standard, it completely punctures the British claim that Indians don't know how to govern themselves. Indians need to be civilized, etc., etc. So there's that angle of how nationalism in the early stage actually existed on very good terms with the princes. The princes were seen as cultural heroes, they were seen as icons, and they were seen as the only people who would give qualified Indians jobs fitted for their position. So for instance, if I were in those days an upper caste Brahmin, usually I would have gone to an English medium school in Madras, and then I would have joined the British service. At most, I would be some kind of a glorified secretary to some white man. There would always be that layer of one white man on top of me, and I would never be in complete control. Whereas the moment these qualified men who spoke English, who could therefore be a bridge between a traditional Raja and the British, they would move to the princely states where their salaries would get doubled or tripled. They would become divans or ministers and be completely in charge of the government. There and the British themselves acknowledged it. When a man called Sheshaya Shastri was appointed from one of these senior bureaucratic posts in Madras, he moved on to become actual minister in Travancore. His own English colleagues said that you could never exist at that level of power in the British territories, but there you are among your own countrymen, ruling them as Indians when you're working in a princely state. So princely states also, therefore, were integral to the emergence of nationalism in the late 19th century, and they were part of that conversation. If you've read Dinyar Patel's book on Dadabhai Nauroji, you would see that Dadabhai Nauroji was very much a champion of the princely states. He had an agency in London which was lobbying for the princely states with the Parliament and the Queen and so on. He used to get donations from the princely states for his East India Association. Those donations are what allowed him right under the nose of Queen Victoria to criticize her country, to criticize her government's deeds and activities in India. And most importantly, long before he became famous as one of the early Indians to win an election in the House of Commons, he was the Diwan of Baroda. He was there in Gujarat,
Yes,
trying to serve and help the Maharaja there so that the state would not be taken over by the British. So the princely states are not just about the palaces. They are about the palaces in the sense that they did build palaces. There were elephants. But as Robin Jeffrey once said, when you see dancing girls and elephants in the princely states, you shouldn't just scoff at it. You should ask, what do they represent? What is the meaning of the dancing girls? Why are there so many number of elephants there? What does the elephant represent? They're sort of touching on older political institutions, older ways of enacting and performing power, as opposed to our perhaps modern, slightly more anglicized way of looking at how these things operate. So again, a very long-winded answer to your short question, but yeah.
No. In fact, that is, I mean, for all the reasons that you've just given, I think it's imperative that accounts of these princely states be included in, in the curriculums, be included in part of the conventional historical narratives, because that is very important, right? So like you said, even when you look at the elephants and you look at, for instance, in your false allies, right? When you say that there was a letter from, I think, Queen Victoria, for which the entire court assembled and, the Maharaja would bow down in front of the letter and all that. I think it has a very complex, it needs to be looked at from more complex lenses rather than just a straightforward lens saying these Maharajas were all, like jokers. I think that's a very...
But, and it's very easy because it's easy to feel related to our own times, right? So our own politicians, no matter, take somebody, an ultra-leftist, ultra-rightist, whatever. When you go abroad, there's always these statesman-like speeches you make because for that audience, that is the message you're projecting. The same politician on the election trail will say completely horrible things, things that should never be coming out of the mouths of such senior dignitaries and functionaries, but they will do it because that is what the audience there requires, and that's how they get their votes. In seminars, they'll take a different tone. In parliament, because cameras are watching, they'll take a different tone. When the cameras are gone and the parliamentary committees are working behind the scenes, they will be much more constructive. Because those in power are always, in a sense, performing for various audiences at the same time. And it's the same with the Rajas. When a letter from Queen Victoria comes, ultimately the British are the most powerful presence in India. And if they demand that you bow down, you will bow down. But as they found in the case of what's his name, Tikojirao Holkar of Indore in the 19th century, he, once after this 1877 a proclamation where she was made empress, he wrote this groveling letter saying, India was a heap of stones, and then the British came and constructed it into this wonderful, beautiful, proper edifice. On the face of it, slavish, submissive Maharaja. But then you look at the British government's own internal records, confidential records on the man, and they describe him as notorious for his disloyalty. Because behind the scenes, he's sort of needling and poking all the other Rajas to stand up to the British. His argument was that I will praise Queen Victoria and I will say and I will grovel outside my state so long as you don't come and interfere in my state. In my internal domain, I am sovereign. So long as you respect that, I will respect your position as my suzerain. If you cross the line, I will also use disproportionate means to fight back. So like today's politicians, think of the Rajas as political actors who are also participants in a complicated universe and are therefore constantly speaking to different audiences and using different strategies depending on who's on the other side.
Absolutely. So you make it sound like a performance of a very complex kind, right?
Politics is performance.
Absolutely. No, so really you've also touched upon the next question that I was going to ask, saying, what are the kind of influences that you can trace to the modern day politics of India? And, somewhere you've already kind of spoken about it to one extent when you kind of compare. Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you, but your screen's sort of frozen, I think.
Yes. Okay, hang on. Let me just, maybe there's just a snag in internet.
Yeah, now it's better. You can see you now.
Yeah. So my next question was going to be about that. It was going to be about what are the kind of influences that you find in modern day politics? Because when you look at the Indian history very clearly, you have 19th century, you have the princely state, like you said, the narratives about the East India Company and then the Maharajas, and then very clear divisions. And the first part of 20th century largely focuses on Gandhi coming back to India and the freedom struggle and, the formation of the Indian nation and all. And then at independence, suddenly we find some sort of a cut, and of course, somewhere we talk about the privy purses, the matter which comes up later on. But we don't really find some sort of a continuation in terms of the influence of the princely states to current day politics directly somewhere. Would you kind of agree to it, or do you think that there still are very, very concrete traces that we can find connections between the princely states and modern day politics?
So in post-colonial India, one of the reasons the princely states was abolished wasn't just because Indira Gandhi felt that in a socialist country it was wrong to give large sums of money when so much of the country was poor. If you look at the actual finances of the government of India, as subsequent scholars have themselves noted, even those not sympathetic to the princes, it wasn't actually such a large amount. Compared to the revenues the government of India gained by the integration of their territories, this was a very small fraction that was paid. The real reason it was the privy purses were cancelled was political, which is that a lot of the Rajas, those that did not join the Congress party, were not happy with the socialist turn, and they were funding opposition parties. Famously, C. Rajagopalachari Swatantra Party, for example, the Janasangh, one of the big funders of the Janasangh was the Rajmata of Gwalior. And she remained a big figure in the party right up there with Vajpayee and Advani, etc., till her death. They were influential, and they wielded, just like back in the day when the British were there, the Rajas would fund the Congress party behind the scenes, and they did that till the late 1920s. Similarly, after independence, with the Congress dominant, they would use their privy purses and resources to back opposition parties. So the privy purses and cancelling it was a way of removing them from the scene and removing their clout from the scene. Even so, however, you do find that if you look for it, you find a certain relevance of this continuing. Now, one of the things is political culture. Lots of parts in our country, say an MLA or an MP gets elected, there's this my baap culture, right? Which is that a person isn't treated as a servant of the people whose job is to go to the legislature and speak for them. He's treated very much as the latest feudal lord. There's a kind of bowing and scraping, because our countries, that the bottom of feudal template hasn't necessarily changed because there's a top-down constitution that's come. So that princely culture, that feudal culture, continues to this day in large chunks of our country, precisely because somehow people still conceive of power and people wielding power as somehow creating that relationship where it's a my baap kind of thing. The other thing is, look at the continued popularity of a lot of royal descendants in politics. I remember my ex-boss Shashi Tharoor telling me about how, he's popular, right? But he goes to Trivandrum and, people look, a couple of people will come for selfies or whatever, and that's it. And then once he went with Jyotiraditya Scindia to his constituency, and it was this huge crowd that showed up to the railway station calling him Maharaj, and this and that, which clearly shows that in those pocket boroughs that still exist, where these royal families have a lot of respect even today, partly romanticized, partly nostalgia, whatever it is, they are still able to utilize that to win democratic elections today. In Kerala, the royal family of Travancore is not part of politics. Of course, what's interesting is that, again, during elections, the Congress candidate, the BJP candidate, and all other candidates except the Communist Party, before they start their campaigns, almost all of them go to the palace for a photo op with the Raja. Even Narendra Modi, before his election in 2014, went to the palace when he was in Trivandrum, and the Raja the then so-called Raja put a turban on his head and a shawl around him, almost as if he was endorsing this candidate. Now, why does Modi was going to win the election? Everybody knew. But why did he need to go there? Because there is still some residual cultural legitimacy that people attach with the Rajas. In Trivandrum, it's not because the Rajas are in politics, but they control the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple, the biggest temple in the state. And even now, the Raja is a citizen on the streets, but it's been affirmed by the Supreme Court that he's still the custodian of the temple. So the moment he crosses the gates of the temple, he again goes back to being a Raja. And every time the deity is escorted out of that temple and taken to the sea, the procession passes through the Trivandrum airport, which is shut down for 3 hours for the king and his deity to pass. And the king is the so-called king is still escorted by Kerala police, because there are still some cultural resonances that appeal to people, and no politician wants to come and tamper with that. So that's another element.
No, so this also reminds me of the Mysore procession during Dasera, the entire Chamri. It's very elaborate, and suddenly you're transported into this old time where of Rajas and Maharajahs, of course, at Ambadi.
And the palace itself,
Absolutely.
it's the most interesting structure because it's in joint possession of the government and the royal family. The government occupies one part of it and the ex-royal family occupies the other part of it.
Yes.
There's in fact studies of kingship. There's a lady who did, I think Maria Balzani, who did a study of the Jodhpur Rajas. There's somebody who did a study of the Udaipur Rajas. And they've discovered that in Udaipur, for example, all the assets, the palaces, all of that has been put into a charitable trust. So even though there's no king now, there is a custodian of the Mewar charitable trust that still controls all these cultural riches. And a lot of royalty, through maintaining museums, through maintaining festivals, through maintaining certain religious rites, etc., continue to have some kind of, it's not a very major influence in society, but there's still some kind of residual influence in society. And there's something to explore there. It's not as if the princes were wiped out in one go. And the very fact that they can still wield that kind of cultural influence is a mark that back in 1947, they weren't lightweights either. They were still pretty potent at that time.
In fact, for historians like us also, I remember when I was in Bhavnagar and I was wanting to access the archives, it normally would require some sort of a letter from Gandhinagar and all that. And then when you say that, you've been sent by the palace, suddenly all the archives open up, everything. So yes, absolutely. So they do wield power. I mean, significant, non-significant, subtle, non-subtle, several ways. I think we're still a young nation that way.
Yeah. 70 years isn't so long, in fact, in a nation's history. Considering the amount of time these chaps were around and the amount of time we've been a democracy, it's no surprise that people they still find it appealing in some way or the other. Even if it is just putting them on the cover of, Vogue magazine or in glossy photo shoots on Instagram or whatever, people still have a sense of, look at the kind of followers some of the younger royal descendants have on social media.
In fact, those younger princes, they're all very, they all, in fact, like to also dress up very elaborately and, adorn that princely attire, and they're extremely well-built and good-looking.
Which, however, does do a disservice to the more serious side of the princely states.
Absolutely.
Because everybody assumes that, again, it's just this. It's just the show. It's just the glamour, and there's nothing behind the glamour. Which is partly because now that there isn't power, the glamour is really all that's left, and therefore there's a kind of over-dependence on it.
In fact, I was talking to somebody from, who comes from the royal family of Bikaner. And he had the same thing to say. He says, really the only place where we find mention now is on the covers of these magazines. But really somebody needs to do more research on how we are doing, and especially the contemporary generation, the younger generation. Like you said, most of them have turned to hospitality and museums and all, but really a lot of them are struggling also. I mean, they have to find their bearings.
There's a friend of mine who jokes that, in Hyderabad, you'll find a lot of Nawabs and then you'll find a lot of kebabs. The thing being that Nawabs are as common as the Hyderabadi kebab because there are so many royal descendants and everybody claims titles and so on, but it has no meaning anymore. It is true,
Yeah. No, so that is, in fact, there's a huge lacuna of there in terms of research about where are these Maharajahs, younger Maharajahs, what are they up to? Some of them would have joined politics, but, so again, coming back to the portrayal of Maharajahs and how they were portrayed, the other side of these Maharajahs was also a very progressive side. Like, we've spoken about it in terms of, especially their divans and, their administrative officers really funding higher education, funding the canal, construction of irrigation facilities, very progressive in their times, which is also not spoken about in history, right? History doesn't do justice to a lot of these states, which are also extremely progressive, much ahead of their times. Like, I'm sure right? From Bhavnagar itself, we had a significant number of students going to MIT to study in the 1920s, and they were funded by the state completely so that they would come back and help in nation building.
There was also the Gondal Maharaja, who was a practicing doctor. He would receive patients. But
Yeah. So, what is it? Can you tell us a little more about these progressive Maharajas, and you find some bit of discussion when you look at the Chamber of Princes and differences in their opinions, but it also led to this camps between themselves, about progressive Maharajas on one hand, and the other ones who are like completely not forward looking.
They used to be called the Rolls Royce Rajas. There were progressive Rajas and there were Rolls Royce Rajas. The idea being that, oh, these guys are just flashy cars type of people, and these are the real Rajas. But I see your point. I'll only qualify the term progressive Rajas in a sense because it wasn't, I make the argument in the book also, which is that it wasn't as though they were progressive out of the goodness of their heart. It wasn't necessarily the case that they built roads and canals because they genuinely thought our subjects need to live a better life. Sometimes it was just a consequence of what was happening in high politics and in the conversation with the British. The British, after 1857, when the East India Company's rule ended and Queen Victoria said that there would be no more annexation, although they said there would be no more annexation, they did say that now all the princes must focus on progress. Now you must focus on improving the lives of your people, etc. Because the British have brought peace to India. There's no more wars. There's no more conquest. Therefore, progress is the next step to be taken. And a lot of Rajas realized that this word progress was something that was just another way for the British to interfere in the princely states. Now, I'll give you an example. I was looking at some old 19th century records on Travancore, and the British come in after this rebellion in 1809, and they look around and they realize there are strong forts. They're mud forts, but they're damn strong. The country is very green, but it also has got a lot of forest areas. It's difficult to penetrate the country. There are only one or two ways of entering the country, and after that, there's only one main highway. All the other roads are these narrow roads, and large parts of the country a single file can travel. It's not more than that, which means your big armies of the East India Company will get bogged down if they actually try to take over this country, which is why they started building larger roads, developing some of those canals, because it was important for troop movement to happen with greater ease. Now, to avoid this, a lot of the Rajas realized that in order to prevent interference from the British, we have to beat them at this game of progress. So most of the Rajas saw themselves as custodians of tradition. As one Raja I quote in the book said, "As I inherited my kingdom, let my heir inherit it." That was the given attitude, which is that I will patronize temples, I will patronize my family deity, I will give gifts to Brahmins. That idea of the Hindu king, and in terms of Muslim rulers, there was a similar idea of the ideal Islamic king. That is what was maintained. Otherwise, as the Maharana of Udaipur said to a British resident, "My subjects have survived 1,000 years without modern roads. What is this big hoo-ha you're making about modern roads? If people have lived for 1,000 years without roads, they will continue to live without roads." There was that attitude. But in some of the bigger, more important states, they realized that if we get onto this progress bandwagon and do a better job than the British, we can keep the British at bay. So there is an investment in education, there is an investment in health, there is an investment in infrastructure, and eventually there's an investment in industry and so on. Mysore being a prime example of that. Mysore took it to a different level. Big dam projects, one of the biggest in the world, iron and steel work, sandalwood, so on and so forth. In Travancore, you have the Maharani funding, supporting the first feature film that's made in Malayalam. So there's that kind of technological investment as well that's happening in the princely states as a response to the pressures from the British Raj. So it's a slightly complicated story. Even so, it had side effects that the Rajas were not always prepared for. For example, you create modern English schools and colleges. And the whole point of being an English school is that everybody has access across castes, across divisions. So where a kid from a certain lower caste background, for example, lower caste in quotes, could not enter a village school run by, say, the local Pandit, he could now go to a missionary school or to an English school. But the result is, once they're educated in this, once they get their degrees and their qualifications, they're going to look for government jobs, which means you're going to have people of the, in quotes, wrong castes coming into your darbar. You're going to have to adjust that. So even though the Rajas got onto this progress bandwagon, the immediate repercussions were also that there were social expectations that came about in society. And those social expectations then brought about political changes in the princely states. If you look at the princely states, nobody was talking about standard of living being poor, because they were actually better than what was happening in British ruled India. Often the Rajas were able to give their people a much higher standard of living than the British. But what you see happening in princely politics on the ground is people coalescing around caste grounds, around communal grounds, saying that, look, the only jobs we can get are these jobs in government or whatever. You must now allot them to us. And the Raja then gets panicky and tries to play his own divide and rule game between the different castes and communities that are there. So it's a very complicated, layered kind of world that is there. And the final thing about this whole idea of progress and Rajas investing more in education and health compared to the British Now, one of the reasons they could do it is also pure economics, because the thing is, the British used to take what was called a subsidy or a tribute from the princely states, and by which the princely states were not supposed to bother about defense. The British would guarantee defense. Now, in Travancore's case, for example, in 1805, it was 8 lakh rupees when the revenue of Travancore was somewhere around 25 lakhs. So it's a huge proportion of your actual defense budget that's outsourced to the East India Company. Cut 100 years, Travancore's revenue is now 1.5 crores, but it's still paying only 8 lakhs for defense. Now, if Travancore had to actually pay for its defense, it would be losing 40, 50 lakhs. But by paying only 8 lakhs, you're saving money, and that saving gets pumped into some of these other schemes. So the British often countered this, propaganda on behalf of the Rajas. The Rajas were so progressive by saying the Rajas are progressive because we are bearing the burden of protecting the Rajas and protecting the princely states. So even that idea of what is progress was actually a very political idea. It was another platform on which the princes and the British negotiated, fought each other, sort of got into conversations with each other, and where the nationalists also came in because they were also wedded to this idea of progress.
Yeah. No, so I understand there is so much of complexity in all these, especially when you look at caste and class-based politics, and you look at, there is so much that really needs to be explored, to be studied. It's not as simplistic as it appears, right? Absolutely. So we have about 10 more minutes, and I'm going to ask you a couple of, in fact, just one question from false allies, and it's something that's, something that I'm just curious about, saying that, you have looked at 5 princely states in your false allies, where you looked at Travancore and Pudukkottai and Baroda, Mysore and Mewar, but largely through the lens of a artist. That to me was, it's not strange, of course, because the way you narrated it is like absolutely brilliant, but why did you choose Raja Ravi Varma? Is there a particular reason? Of course, it's very clear, but why Raja Ravi Varma, would you say? Go on.
This, goes back to that first question on, the number of princely states, right? There were so many princely states. Even if I shortlisted the main ones, I was sitting with about 100 in my basket. And the thing is that I didn't want to do, Barbara Ramosak's done a sort of general textbook on the princely states where she covers a large number. I don't want to do that kind of a book. I really wanted to take individual case studies and each distinct from the other. All the same, from the time of my Travancore book, I've been working on this subject technically from 2009, right? So I didn't want my ideas and my biases to affect how I would select the princely states. So I thought, take this character, Ravi Varma. He's actually just making cameo appearances in the book, He's never really the main figure. He's just this thread that connects the 5 states. And if I realized that this man was very popular, he was friends with Gokhale, Tilak, the nationalists, he attended Congress meetings, etc. All the same, in that interesting period, he was also painting the Rajas, he was also painting the British governors and so on. And I thought that if I follow his career trajectory, he will take me through a number of princely states and I don't have to choose anything. So each state will get chosen for me, and then I can approach the research with my mind as unbiased as possible, because these are not subjects I've already studied in the past. So Travancore, yes, where he was born, I had studied in the past. But the next state he goes to is Pudukkottai. This tiny state in Tamil Nadu, ruled by the robber caste, has this fascinating history where I had to go in, and that's a robber caste state. Then he goes to Baroda, which is ruled by the Marathas with the Gujarati subjects. Then he comes to Mysore, where there's this fascinating legal battle the Rajas waged against the East India Company and then the Crown. There's this huge politics with the Lingayats and Vokalingas. And that also brings me to that earlier question on the relevance of the princely histories to today. Even today, Karnataka politics revolves around the Lingayats and Vokalingas.
Oh, yes.
And you see this Raja being toppled in 1830 because of that politics and because he wasn't able to control it. So then Ravi Varma comes to Mysore. Finally, he goes to Udaipur, which is a completely different thing. So if Travancore is ultra bureaucratized, there are English reports, the Raja is writing in English, their diaries are in English, everything is highly sort of on the Western model. In Udaipur, the Raja, and these Rajas pose with the medals that the British have given them. In Udaipur, the Raja won't even pose with the medal. He poses with the shield and sword, just like his Rajput ancestors in miniatures long before Ravi Varma. And he refuses to build roads. He refuses to do what the British want. To get him to accept a single order, it sometimes takes 20 years because he's not the type who listens to the British. Very feudal structure. But again, it has its own interesting dynamics of tribal resistance within, tribal resistance underneath, resistance from the Jat peasants, etc. Again, a very different kind of princely state. So I think, what was interesting was that Ravi Varma allowed me to choose a very eclectic set of states without my sort of selection bias coming in and me trying to decide which of the 100 states to study. There were prestigious states like Mysore, there were tier 3 states like Pudukkottai, there were old-fashioned Rajput states, there were bureaucratized states, there was industrialization, there was tribal relations, there was legal battles, talk of nationalism. All of this could be covered only, I thought, by following this Ravi Varma technique and just getting him and his paintings to speak to me. And he also did all these wonderful portraits of the Rajas, and there's so much to interpret in those portraits as well, because none of those portraits were just about likenesses. They were about the political image the Rajas wanted to project.
Right. No, so if I have to ask you, saying what else, which other character would you have chosen out of history to do some sort of a similar exercise? Do you have anybody else in mind other than Ravi Varma who could have traveled like this, and you would have to, you would have been able to write through his lens?
I could have chosen another artist, which is Val Prinsep. He was this guy who had come in the 1870s, and he traveled through several courts. He was there at the 1877 Darbar, where Queen Victoria was declared empress and so on. And he's actually done sketches and paintings of several Rajas. A bunch of them are in the museum in Delhi, and I think some are abroad. And he wrote actually a travel diary about this. There was actually a French photographer who traveled through India, and there are these wonderful anecdotes he's left. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but yeah, Rousselet, I suppose. He came and he's left these colorful anecdotes about how he went to Baroda and how the then Maharaja Khande Rao basically was so impressed with him that he got him to wear the Baroda state jewels and clothes and pose as the Raja, and just basically got a laugh out of it, weird things like that. But the thing is, I didn't want to use a European for it. As I said, one of the important things about this period is also the emergence of the Indian identity and Indian nationalism. And there Ravi Varma was key, because the other set of paintings he did, in the princely states, it was portraits mainly, but the princes also patronized him to do mythological works. And there's this, he was very conscious, and he was told by his patrons like Sir T. Madhav Rao, the Diwan of Baroda, that if you make these pictures accessible to the people, you will help construct a national imagery, of course, very rooted in Hindu culture, but you'll create some kind of a common thread by which, in a country where people are divided by language, by clothes, by food habits, by complexion, even bathing styles, everybody, however, knows the Mahabharata, everybody knows characters from Ramayana and so on. So if you're able to construct a visual imagery for them, it will help build this nation. And that is why Ravi Varma decides to create his lithograph press and create cheap prints of these paintings of mythological works, of mythological characters and stories, which are then in lots of homes in India, and they help create that conversation. So I thought, instead of these European painters or a photographer like Deen Dayal, Ravi Varma is specifically interesting because he was also not, let's say, a very active participant, but he was certainly in the backdrop for these nationalistic kind of projects as well, attending the Congress party and its industrial exhibition. Things like that made him this interesting bridge between the change that was happening, but also the old world of the Rajas, because he was born in a princely state and was himself a royal descendant.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little exhausted, but I have a couple more questions. One is a fairly personal question, in the sense, I'm going to ask you how you felt when you wrote lines, which go, for instance, in Lord Napier, in your False Allies, you've written, once said to Madhav Rao, the Diwan of Travancore, saying, if educated young men can show that they are equal Europeans, that they can equal Europeans, not only in their capacity to do good service, but in the strictest integrity in every sense of the word, it will be a great thing accomplished for a community. I'm glad that in your conduct hitherto, you have shown yourself quite alive to the importance of this point. Now, when you are, of course, writing it, as a historian also, what goes through your mind? Does it agitate you? Does it make you feel, really? I mean, you can't, of course, we disconnect when we fill the shoes of becoming an historian, but even then, somewhere when you were writing accounts of all these European people and what they had to say about us and our culture, how is it that you feel?
Actually, this was actually Madhav Rao writing to one of his junior officers, saying that, in a world where the Europeans claim they're better than us, this by actually excelling, by actually being better than them, we can actually counter that. But the quote is still interesting because there's so much happening in it, right? One of the first things you notice is that this generation of Indian nationalists have internalized the Western notion that we have to match up to Western standards in order to meet approval and prove that we can govern. So you're already buying in the intellectual argument of colonialism that somehow the West is ahead of the East.
Absolutely.
And one doesn't blame them. Again, Dinyar Patel, for example, talks about how this generation, whether it's Dadabhai Naoroji, Madhav Rao, Shesha Shastri, they were born in the 1820s and they were young men when the 1857 rebellion took place. And they saw the rebellion fail. So for them, military action was never a choice because that one shot that was there, it had failed. The only option was to pick up the English language, pick up the jargon that the West was using, pick up the language of democracy, pick up the language of justice, and deploy that against the colonizer, but in a way that wasn't too aggressive for you to be shut down. So, even the Congress party, if somebody from the BJP were today to read it, they look at the early Congress meetings, proceedings, and they'll see that everything begins with paying homage to Queen Victoria. But, it's actually a clever device because the Congress, by beginning and saying that, look, we're not against Queen Victoria, we're not actually disloyal, but you're sort of creating a caveat, you're protecting yourself from legal action, from suppression, from the British using various legal techniques they had to shut you down. So the Queen and paying homage to the Queen was one means of preserving your own capacity to say something. If it's today, I suppose, anybody who wants to say something, but first say, oh, I'm a very big nationalist, but let me criticize the government because otherwise you're branded anti-national. So, it's a similar kind of strategy that they were using. Now, in this particular quote also, Madhav Rao has internalized it. I think it's Ashish Nandi who basically talks in his famous study on this, what's it called, The Intimate Enemy, where he talks about how, our minds were colonized, by which, we even judged ourselves on parameters that were given by the colonizer. It took a while for us to discard those parameters under Gandhiji and others and so on. So this is happening in the context of that. And of course, the British are, there are good Englishmen, there are bad Englishmen. There were Englishmen who were quite happy to see Indians rule, and it quite openly admitted that, there would be a time when the British would have to leave. So Madhav Rao, for example, Shesha Shastri, V. Ramayangar, one of the Diwans of Mysore called Rangacharlu, all these people were products of a single school, English school in Madras, where they were all extremely devoted to their headmaster, who was a man from Britain. But he really shaped these men up, gave them the confidence and said, go out and sort of, seize the world. And even though he was a white man, the kind of dedication they had to him was genuine. And his affection for them was also genuine, because every time they reached positions of influence, he felt that he had achieved something. There are ways of deconstructing this relationship, but it's also true. But then you have the villainous kind of Englishman also, who puts these people down, scuttles promotions, for example, saying that brown men cannot be given these posts, tries to bully Maharajahs, tries to bully these Diwans. A lot of these Diwans, when they would become part of the princely states and part of the Raja's administrative apparatus, they would stand up for the Raja's rights. So the British issued an order saying that no white man can be tried in any court by a Maharaja. And then, in Travancore, the Divan basically says you can't say that, because unless Travancore by treaty gives you the right, anybody who commits a crime within the bounds of Travancore is subject to the Maharajas. It's a give and take, and finally a compromise is reached. But it's interesting that these guys are standing up and they're using that jargon of democracy and justice to fight back. When Vishakam Tirunal Maharaja of Travancore, some of the Maharajas were also good writers. They engaged in some of these things. They wrote newspaper columns. They would comment on public issues. There was this rumor going around that the governor of Madras, Mountstuart Grandduff, he was extremely agitated that, all the young Indians who were going to English colleges were coming out shouting slogans against the British. And he said the government is going to stop investing in higher education in India, because we're just creating a class of politicians who are fighting the British. So why should we put in money? It was just a rumor, but it went around for a time. And this Raja of Travancore actually wrote a letter, an open letter. So this whole culture of open letters is not a new thing, by the way. It happened in the 19th century also. He wrote an open letter saying that it's a calumny to say that by giving these young men English education, they're turning into a race of discontented people. On the contrary, you should think of it this way, that you're equipping a set of people to run the country well, so that when the day comes, the British can leave feeling like they've achieved something in India. Now, again, the Raja is being very diplomatic. He's not offending the British, but he's also saying, don't do this because we need this, and ultimately you're going to have to leave, so at least let there be enough people who can run a modern bureaucracy and so on and so forth. So again, that this sort of talking down at Indians, that conversation that's happening, a lot of it happened through speeches. You look at Nauroji's East India Association's proceedings, you look at the newspaper articles and commentary that was happening. In those, you discover that actually the Rajas and Diwans are very tuned in. They could fight quite aggressively against the British, and they could play the British emotionally as well. Sheshaya Shastri at one point, an Englishman writes something and he basically says, this would be worthy of Russia to say, but not from the great English nation. They're basically playing the Englishman's own ego that we are better than Russia and saying that, Acha, look, if you're actually better than Russia, you better do justice to India. So it's actually a very intricate, complex, layered kind of exchange that's taking place.
Yeah, in fact, when you read a lot of their accounts and their writing, they're extremely politically correct way of stating things. Very, very interesting to see how they posit. They mean something else, but they're saying something else, and you have to really read into it to kind of.
Which is the historian's job, right? Like if I wanted to do politics, I would take things at face value. But when you want to really understand
but Manu, you still have to answer my questions. Like, how do you feel when you read all this? Does it agitate you to any extent, saying that all these people came and they ruled over us and they made us go
Not really, because you see, if as much as the British tried to coerce people and bully people, and sometimes they managed to do that, there was always resistance to them, and that resistance took multiple forms, and some of them extremely creative. They're the most hilarious kind of things. For example, again, one of these Rajas, he was basically an English tutor was forced on him. And the Rajas' families hated this because they thought the Rajas would be deracinated. They would be made to hate their own culture, and they would not have anything in common with their people. If you grow up speaking English and then your subjects are speaking a different language, you think in English, and what about your people? So the women in the palace would object to this. And there were ways in which the Raja could make his disapproval known. So, for example, he couldn't get rid of the tutor because the tutor had been imposed by the British, but all the same, he could use caste, for example. So he'd say, oh, the tutor can't stand on the same carpet as me because I will be defined with caste. If the tutor touches me, I have to go take a bath. These were ways of putting the British in their place, also saying that you can bully me here, I will gain one over you through caste or ritual. Even so, there was violence also. There's a first Maharaja of Kolhapur, a young boy who was adopted, and the British decided to train him to be the ideal Indian prince, very loyal to the empire, etc. This boy did not want it. Poor chap tried to run away disguised as a bullock cart driver. Finally, he was beaten to death by his English ward. Like, there was a scuffle and he was physically killed in that process. So there is violence, there is complete atrocity even in the princely states. Even so, the princes always managed to find ways to retaliate. Sometimes it could be by making sure they knew who the British agent, the British representative in their court was sleeping with. You find out who his mistress is, you find out who his illegitimate children are. That becomes a thing you can use against the British resident. Sometimes you bribe the British, and it wasn't just the resident. In the early 19th century and late 18th century, there was this, what was his name? The Holland brothers. Holland was the governor of Madras. He used to take bribes left, right, and center from princes, and accordingly amend the policy of the British government to their requirements. So, and that continued under the table for a long time. So you had ways in which you could bribe the residents. You could manipulate what information was going out. One of my favorites is Ram Singh of Jaipur. He was this. His treaty with the British basically meant that any revenue over 40 lakhs, he had to give a cut to the British. So he simply fudged his accounts. For years and years, his money never went beyond 39 lakhs, beyond 39.5 lakhs. In reality, he was getting 60 lakhs. But he kept fudging the accounts and not giving the British their due. The British knew it, but they could do nothing because, you can't really, they didn't have that kind of power in the bigger states to go in and do as they wished. So there was always, I'm never infuriated because I also find the most wonderful ways in which the Rajas were able to retaliate. And one more, anecdote from the Rajput states. There's this Udaipur, he was the chief Rajput, right? And every time he went for these British darbars, his own courtiers would be very unhappy, saying, you are the son of the Hindus, you are like somebody who never bowed before the Mughals also. How can you go bow before the British king? And the Maharana came up with a very clever device. To satisfy the British, he would come to Delhi in his special train with his entire court or whatever. But on the eve of the Darbar, he would fall ill. Very convenient diplomatic illness by which he could save face. He would not physically go and bow down in front of the British king. Technically, he didn't disobey the British also because he came there. It's just that he fell ill, in quotes.
Right.
So
Right.
it's wonderful to actually uncover these details and find that no matter when there's oppression, there's always people resisting,
Absolutely.
no matter how powerful the oppressor is. Something that's valuable for our own times.
Agreed entirely. Yes, thank you. Okay, maybe my last question. To do with the research and your own research and the kind of challenges that we face while doing research. In terms of preservation, in terms of archives, would you agree that the West has preserved their history in a better manner than we have? Because there has, you look at, for instance, if I just talk to you about Saurashtra Kathiawad, which is my area of research, there are so many historical places which are completely unkempt, vandalized. Then there are a lot of family archives which never come to the fore because the families are holding on to them, either because they don't realize the importance or they're just very, they don't see the larger picture. Do you think the West, therefore, has done definitely a better job at digitizing, preserving their history versus us?
I think it's certainly easier to work in a lot of Western archives. For example, there's, not just the West actually. Now, if you think of the Asiatic Society in Bombay, they've digitized their entire old newspaper collection. So you have Times of India, a bunch of mostly English papers, but it's all digitized now. You can get a 12,000 rupees subscription per year and access all of it. But that's relatively new in India. A lot of the material is easier to access in Western archives. I'm very lucky because I work on the colonial period for most part. And for all documents that were maintained in Madras or Calcutta or whatever, there was always a copy sent to the Court of Directors in London. So the Madras proceedings, the Bengal political proceedings, the secret proceedings, the foreign proceedings, there is a copy of each of those things sitting in London as well, which is great because if you actually go to the archives in India sometimes, I had this experience in Delhi, right? You go to the National Archives, you place an order for a certain file, you sometimes have to wait 4 or 5 hours. I don't know how it's now. This was a few years ago. 4 or 5 hours. And then it comes back to you saying, oh, this file can't be traced. And you're like, I just wasted all this time looking at, the thin air, waiting for this file, and then it's not there. How can a file go missing when it's in your catalog system?
Right.
Whereas that same file I can obtain in an exact 45-minute thing in an online digitized system in the British Library in London. Same material. Often there's a lot more material there because when the British left, they shipped off a lot of the sensitive, confidential material, especially on the princely states, to London because they didn't want Nehru and the Congress and Patel to blackmail the princes. So a lot of the interesting secret files of what is actually happening behind the scenes is preserved not in the Indian archives, but in London, which also makes it interesting. But then
I'm sure you have access to a lot of these interesting stories, no, man?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes it's visual evidence also. The Ram Singh of Jaipur was a great photographer, and there are scholarly articles about how he took pictures of his zenana women. And the British had this stereotype of women in harems being extremely lonely and sad, whereas the ones he's actually photographed, they're all these extremely good looking in the sense of very powerful looking women. Interesting, confident, the way they look at the camera, they don't look like coy, oppressed women locked up in a harem. They look like women of personality, which is an interesting thing because that visual evidence gives you a different way of looking at the harem. But what's not known to these scholars is that this particular Raja also took naughty pictures of himself with his camera, early selfies that were quite naughty. And there's actually a collection that in which some of these exist. I believe it's now somewhere in Bombay. But there are some of these things are floating around largely in the West. In Indian royal families, especially, I believe in Travancore, I remember hearing the story that a lot of the old palace records, somewhere in the 70s, they decided, why are we holding on to the daily records of the kitchen and this and that? Let's just burn it. It was all destroyed. Whereas in reality, the palace kitchen is interesting because you get to know who was fed there, what were the caste rules, what was the caste of the cooks. All of those details gone up in flames. Whereas diaries, etc., preserved often in the West, and sometimes in obscure places, in obscure archives. There is a whole culture of keeping private papers and so on. So it's definitely easier in the West to get down to research. You save a lot of time. You can be a lot more efficient. Whereas here, you have to be very patient and very, very sort of, you really have the forbearance to put up with bureaucratic issues and this and that. As you said, sometimes you really have to get some VIP to put in a word just because otherwise it simply doesn't move.
Talking about VIPs, my last question. Absolutely, Manu. Sorry. How is it working with Mr. Tharoor. And, he has this very famous speech in the parliament about how Britain owes so much to India. Was he the inspiration for you to kind of explore this colonial history and,
No, I mean, I won't say that's true, because if you look at the chronology, I was already working on my Travancore book when the speech happened since 2009. So I was always interested in it, but we certainly have certain areas of common interest, and we actually even disagree sometimes on it. For example, I've done public sessions with him on his book on empire, and one of the pitfalls or one of the critiques I had was that, I mean, it's obviously a polemical kind of thing. It's making a point that it's a valid point that colonialism was a deeply scarring experience for those who were colonized. But all the same, sometimes you find, for example, that it was because the British were here that Dalit castes were able to finally assert themselves politically. They were finally able to get an education. It was in English that Jyotiba Phule, who belongs to a Mali caste, which would now be counted as OBC, it was in English that he read The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. It was in a missionary school that he managed to gain education. And then he became this big social reformer in Maharashtra, who helped widows, who helped pregnant widows, who helped girls get education, etc. So, the British presence in India ended up also, in some sense, empowering segments that in the traditional system did not have any influence or any power to speak of. So, it's like the Dalit community celebrating the Battle of Bhima Koregaon, where the Peshwa actually lost to the East India Company, simply because they were fighting for the East India Company, because the East India Company had no issues hiring Mahar or so-called untouchable castes in their army. So for them, it's not about the British winning over an Indian. It's about the Dalits winning over a Brahminical ruler. So again, if you look at it, depending on where you're parked in India and which strata of society you're located in, your view of colonialism will sort of shift a little bit, with it. And for me, it's not a question of, oh, this is right and that is wrong. All of these are equally accurate. All of these are equally valid. The whole point of history is not to sit with a danda and decide which is good and which is bad. It is to sit and understand the complexity and realize that there is no simple answer. Good history actually it doesn't give you answers, it provokes more questions. And, for that, I think colonialism is a shared interest with Dr. Tharoor, because the questions never end. It was such a deeply scarring thing for Indians. Even the way we think of ourselves, the way we think of what is traditional, the way we think of our culture, everything was so affected by colonialism that, it's a topic that you can keep researching for an entire lifetime and still just scrape the surface.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll have to now take questions, and I'll begin by. Do you want to?
So, hi Tana, can I come in? Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. So in the background, Sudhir and I have been kind of reaching out to some of the people who posted questions, and some of them have agreed to come on camera and ask their questions. So we'll start with those, and then we'll read out, or you can read out any others asked directly. So to begin with, Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, first of all, Professor, we are honored that you've attended this webinar. It's a real honor to have you in the audience. Would you want to come on camera and ask your question?
Yeah. Should I will probably not use my video because of bandwidth issues. Sure. So if I'm audible, both Tana and Manu, I will proceed.
Yes, absolutely.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much. I begin with the caveat that I haven't read your book, but I will. And therefore, the questions that I ask are not in response to something I haven't read, but in response to something I've been interested in. I'm going to react to two things. One is that we have had a fairly long and deep corpus of work on princely states, maybe not so excitingly written by historians who are not quite that racy, but very solid historical work. And I can think from the 80s onwards, from Robin Jeffrey to Pamela Price to people who have worked on Pudukkottai, in fact, many, many important states, and people who don't work on princely states necessarily, but who look at cultural practices of music, technology, cinema, have all thought about princely modernity. So I think we therefore need to keep that in mind, that there is this corpus. Now, as a historian who writes, and I haven't read it, so I'm not going to brand you as either rock star or public, I have to read the book before I decide. When you wrote the book on princely states, what was your abiding rationale? Agreed that it is to debunk the existing sense that these guys were really, they were hollow crowns, to use Nick Dirks. Obviously, you were going to do something more. And that probably was the rationale. But having decided to use use a personality like Ravi Varma, who really circulates within a particular circuit of princely states, I'm sort of curious as to how your book departs from the kind of work that we already have. That's one simple, straightforward question on the book, and I promise I will read it and probably get back to you. The second and more larger question that I'm kind of interested in is, there is this whole concern about history being tedious, boring, not so interesting, and now we need to do it really interestingly. We need public historians write about the Vadiyars or Gohar Jan or Veer Savarkar or Ravi Varma, and that somehow is going to, like a magic wand, make history interesting. Now, I'm kind of concerned, I'm curious about your views on making history interesting as a project. I mean, do we have the same anxiety for, say, sociology or science? Why is it that with history, we are always put on the dock for writing something serious and following protocols and having procedures, which is why we are a discipline. And yet we have to face this constant barrage of criticism that it is ultimately tedious or it's a non-skill subject. So I'd like your views on that.
Thank you. Those are very good questions. In fact, where I differ from this whole hollow crown thesis is precisely that, which is that the crown was actually not hollow. In that sense, I sort of side with Pamela Price's counter to Nick Dirks, which was that, in fact, the crown was constantly adapting and it was not actually hollowed by the British. That gives the British too much agency in the relationship with the princes, and it takes away the agency of the princes themselves to respond as dynamic actors who are capable of responding. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, I would disagree that there is adequate research on the princely states. If you think of the proper studies purely on the princely states, there's Jeffrey and James Manor in the 70s, and Barbara Ramasak did her PhD then. Then there's a bunch of works in the 80s, Nick Dirks, Pramila Price in the 90s. There's a work on Shiva Ganga. There's a few studies, but if you count them, I don't think you would exceed more than 20. So I thought there was, some kind. Barbara Ramasak ended up having to do a second book on the princely states, where she again in 2004 states that there still hasn't been that kind of investment in the political histories and the internal workings of the princely states as political institutions ruled by political actors. Yes, certain elements. I think Janki Bakle has done it on music. In the Baroda court, for example, that sort of thing exists, and there are studies on the cultural side of kingship, perhaps, but not necessarily the political side and the reaction and the response to colonialism. And where there is, it tends to lean towards Dirks's hollow crown thing, which is that the Rajas had less agency and somehow they were manipulated by the British and didn't have enough personality or capacity to respond. Whereas my argument is actually it's just the way of how we look at responses. If you're looking for some kind of like sexy or in your face kind of response, you're not going to find it. But if you scratch beneath the surface, you'll find a world of strategies through which they were responding to the princely states. On the whole thing about making history popular, the thing is, what I attempt to do, for example, is to keep the research extremely rigorous while making sure the writing is accessible to a larger audience. And it's not necessarily because, history is a boring subject. I never found it boring. I'm working on my PhD thesis now, for example, and the gems you find in the academic universe, it's amazing. The engagement with theory, it's so interesting. It's a fresh kind of challenge. It certainly makes sense. And you need some of that gatekeeping, some of those strategies to preserve, as you said, the integrity of the discipline itself. In fact, I reviewed the book on Savarkar, and that was one of the critiques I made of the book, which is that it touches all the sources, but doesn't use critical analysis to interrogate those sources. Yeah. So, you can't take Savarkar's biography and autobiography and everything he says at face value. You're supposed to pose that against other evidence and interrogate what he's saying and then reach a conclusion. So, but I think one of the reasons people now sort of keep saying a lot that, history needs to be made more interesting, etc., is partly because there's the sense that history has been so politicized that
Right.
somehow we are unable to communicate good, well-researched history to the layman. The layman is not coming to the seminar circuit. There's a limit to the classrooms that they're exposed to. So much of India, even the middle class, is exposed just to that technocratic IIT kind of education, where you don't have access to the humanities. You have very little exposure to the humanities. That you fall for this kind of WhatsApp history. You fall for all kinds of twisted narratives. Anything that seems even vaguely probable, you'll believe it because you're not exposed to how history is done. So I think public history or popular history is trying to fill that gap. But I would never say that it's because the other histories are boring. It's just that I think that serves one purpose. This serves another purpose, and both are interlinked. It's almost as if this is a bridge to connect the what's happening in the seminar circuit to a larger audience of intelligent readers. You can't convince everybody. Ultimately,
I think
the people who've come for this talk as well, it's people who have an interest in following the subject. Those who are susceptible to WhatsApp history are unlikely to come even to this talk. It's just, one way of I suppose, widening the pool of people who are able to discern good history from, let's say, sloppy history or history with
bridging role is something that we need to do. Thank you very much.
And in fact, a lot of academics are now doing it as well. I can think of Sophia Gandhi, for example. She wrote a book on Dara Shukla. It's because even the academic presses, that's actually published by Harvard University Press, but she's worn her research very lightly. She doesn't use let that sort of dominate the text. The text is very readable. The notes are where you can get the hard kind of research and the.
But we have to do it. I mean, it's the challenge of our times.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi ji, for joining and for your comments. We have a question from Dhruv Goel. Dhruv, would you be able to come on camera and ask it? Dhruv, are you able to ask your question? Okay, maybe we'll come back to Dhruv. Sharat Kumar, are you able to come on camera and ask your question?
I think people may be shy about turning on their cameras.
They agreed to, but maybe they've stepped out. Okay, we'll come back to some of them certainly. Jyotsna, you also had.
Sharat is here, and I think.
Sharat, you're here. Okay, Sharat, yes, go ahead, please. You are on mute, Sharat. If you can unmute yourself. Yeah, not very. Maybe if you can be a bit louder.
Okay, so I must first congratulate Pillai for his beautiful work. And as I see, I find it very inclusive. I mean, you have tried to bring in those also who have been much criticized. At the same time, you see, I had a few questions. You see, what happens is, whatever you say, you see, the British devastated the country. I mean, we talk about governance, and when we talk about governance, we expect that it will lead to some development. But here is an example, a case study, where they have devastated the whole economy. And since I come from an economics background, you see, the question which I would like to put to you is that, you see, the most important source of revenue for the British was the land revenue. And if you look at this, you see, the philosophy of land revenue, if you look at the Hindu India and the ancient India, you see, they had a kind of a maxim that, well, land revenue should not go beyond 25%. It was only during the time of Alauddin Khilji where he raised it to 50%. And again, we find that in the times of Akbar, he brought it down to 30%, and naturally, besides other reasons, this was one reason for his popularity. In the case of British, you see, governance, we find that again, the land revenue has been pushed to 50%. Same at the level of the, what you call, Alauddin Khilji. Now, you can verify it at your level. But at the same time, what I am curious about is that you have so many princely states. Now, what was the kind of a land revenue pattern with As far as Rajasthan is concerned, I had kind of an example somewhere. They were also very exploitative. It was 50%, 60%. But I'm curious to know what was the situation in other parts of the country. And as far as the relationship between the crown and these princely states are concerned, you see, as far as the big zamindars were concerned, they were supposed to give 50% of the land revenue to them. But what was happening as far as the relationship between the crown and the princely states were concerned? So this is my question.
I don't know what the exact percentage of the yield that the Rajas took was, but yes, it varied a great deal depending on which princely state we're talking about. The Rajput state that I've covered, for example, is Mewar, and you find that actually, yes, it was a very oppressive, extractive kind of machinery that the Raja had, which was basically to keep up the Rajput elite in their control over the Jat peasants and the Bhil tribal groups that were there. And it was extremely exploitative. And you find eventually that the Maharanas toppled because of peasant resistance and because of a tribal uprising that takes place in the early 1920s, late 1910s. In a state like Travancore, on the other hand, it was much better. You know, the Raja did not take a large chunk of the yield that was produced because the trade was the state was a coastal state and had access to its own seaports and a huge volume of trade. In the 20s, the revenue of the state was, I think, 2.5 crores, but the trade was in the range of 20 crores, which meant the government was able to raise customs and other kinds of income from it. In fact, this was traditionally the case in Kerala. If you look at Dilip Menon's work on Malabar, for example, you'll find that he uses the term houses by the sea because the royal families, largely the big ones, were all based in coastal areas. They primarily drew their resources from trade and from their own landed estates, not from tax from the people. In fact, there's an ongoing debate among scholars of Kerala about whether there was even land tax in Kerala till Tipu Sultan came. Apparently, it was Tipu Sultan who came and said, how can you not have land tax and then impose land tax? It's a debated subject, but what seems to be the case is the rulers were not dependent on the land. They were dependent chiefly on trade, which is why Arabs and then afterwards the European trading companies became important. So again, another thing that would matter is also the kind of soil pattern that was there, the kind of agriculture that was there, and the geography of the states. In a lot of states, you find that the Rajas could not be too oppressive to the peasants simply because the peasants could get up and leave. They would go off to some other state or they would go off to a British district wherever they would get better terms. And there was so much wasteland in India. There was so much land that was uncultivated that other states and other districts would happily take these people simply because there was land available that needed to be tilled. So it wasn't as if the peasants lacked agency. The peasants lacked the capacity to stand up to oppression. Wherever it was there, they had the capacity to do so. Even in Mewar, the Maharana actually prevented the peasants from leaving. He issued orders saying you cannot leave the Jagir or you cannot leave the state and so on, because the threat was real. If any Raja pushed too hard, people would just leave, which is why there was always a kind of conversation taking place between ruler and the ruled. And you find that even in the princely states, other than peasants, there were bankers, there were trading communities. All of these people had mechanisms by which they could negotiate with the Raja. And if the Raja was still not cooperative, they could turn against the Raja. And that's what happened in Mysore. Krishnaraja Vadiyar III, he was not a bad ruler. There was, officially speaking, the revenues were there, all of that was there. But the thing is, he alienated the Lingayats or the Veerashaiva community. They were a big agrarian community there. He ended up alienating other segments, which was the Maratha bureaucracy of his court. Those two came together, joined the British, and kicked the Raja out of the state. He was kicked off his throne. And for 50 years, the British took up direct administration of the state. So even a Raja within a princely state could be toppled by his own subjects. There was no guarantee that the Raja was all powerful and the peasants would obey him. The relationship between the ruling authority and the peasantry was far more complex than, some of these textbooks would give us the impression, the simplistic school textbook saying, oh, we oppressed our peasants and the peasants, became communists or whatever in a later period. Those are simplistic narratives. In reality, there's a lot of room for negotiation between the two.
In fact, there is the agricultural debt redemption scheme of Bhavnagar, which is very famous, where the Darbar actually waived off all the agricultural debt so as to ensure that the farmers they don't suffer. And again, like you said, the business communities, the business groups are the ones who kind of mediated and said, look, we need to do this. So that was very important.
They had tremendous influence, the business community, because there were no
states-
modern banks then. So
Did the princely states pay some tribute to the crown?
depends. Again, it depends on which princely state. For example, a princely state like Pudukkottai did not even have a signed treaty with the British. The relationship was entirely verbal. There was no written treaty that determined what the exact relationship between Pudukkottai and the British was. And there was no tribute paid by Pudukkottai to the company or to the British crown. At one point, just for the sake of it, the British tried to impose some 5 elephants or some such tribute on the Pudukkottai Raja, but he refused to pay. And so there was never a tribute collected there. With the princely state like Mysore, the tribute was very high. In fact, the Mysore Rajas, even until the 1920s and 30s, would complain about how their tribute was such a large share because, the British had imposed it after Tipu Sultan's fall. Tipu was their worst enemy, so they gave the state the worst treatment they could think of and demanded a very high tribute. A state like Travancore, relatively speaking, had a more medium kind of tribute, 8 lakh rupees, even when their revenue touched 9 crores. In 1947, their revenue was 9 crores. It was, I think, the 4th richest province in India, but they were paying only 8 lakhs to the British in tribute. So that it varied again, depending on which princely state we're talking about and how exactly they came within the frame of the colonial, system that had been set up.
Thank you, Sharat sir, and thank you, Manu and Tana, for your responses. Manu, I know we had booked you till 5:30. We are past that. Would you give us another few minutes? There
Sure.
are a couple of
We'll take a few more questions.
So thank you. We'll just take a few more minutes. Jyotsna, you had a question. Would you be able to come and ask that now?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you, Tana and Manu, for this engaging talk. And I've actually started reading Paul Sarai's, but I haven't been able to complete it. But I have heard various of your other talks on the same topic. So I guess I can ask you this question. I just wanted your opinion, and this is an argumentative opinion. And this is a what if question. In an alternate universe, would the Rajas be able to have reached an agreement as they had previously with the British, with the Indian Union? Was that even a possibility if, as you do like mention in the latter parts of your book, that they did start becoming more autocratic in nature, and obviously the Congress leaders did not want to let go of their power. Would there have ever been a situation where they could have probably argued their way into an alliance with the Indian Union? And if they did, what positions would they probably hold today? That's my question.
In fact, I don't need to think too much for it because other people had thought about this in the 19th century. So M.G. Ranade, when he thought about India's future, he envisioned a parliamentary system where the British provinces would give a kind of House of Commons and the princely states would constitute a kind of House of Lords, by which both would be part of the parliamentary system, but they would still retain their autonomy and their independence as separate units. That was one. The other thing is, yes, I think there was a window for the princes to really carve out a place for themselves in post-colonial India. It was in the 1930s, even the 1935 Government of India Act. In fact, a lot of our constitution is lifted from the Government of India 1935 Government of India Act and sort of just pasted into our constitution because it had sort of envisioned a federal structure. It was envisioning, legislature, federal institutions, etc., where the British provinces as well as the princely states would be part of the conversation. The problem, however, was that while the federal system in British India, the constitution and the 1935 laws were enacted. So in fact, by 1937, there were Congress governments that were ruling different provinces in India. Elections had been held under the British, and Madras, for example, was ruled by a Congress government. Of course, certain ministries such as defense, etc., were with the British, but education, health, etc., were given to Indian politicians who had formed the government. The princes, however, did not take the opportunity when they could. They, in fact, tried to use this. They saw that the British wanted them. They saw that maybe the nationalists also want them. And instead of, I suppose, joining the table and constructively considering their role in the future, they tried to use this to negotiate small things for themselves. Travancore, for example, said, I want a 21-gun salute, and I want an old agreement on customs completely revoked, and I want full customs to come to me. That was one example. Nizam of Hyderabad had some other petty thing that he wanted. So the princes, when they were given a seat at the table, in a sense, they squandered the opportunity. The other thing is the princes were never able to come together and lobby as a group. The British were always extremely paranoid. In fact, there's this wonderful quote from an official who says that when the Chamber of Princes was being considered, it was this one body where the princes would come together and sort of talk to each other. He said, we should not be encouraging a trade union of the princely states because they still have vast resources. They still have a lot of money. They have a lot of cultural legitimacy and clout. It was a Maharaja who signed the Treaty of Versailles. He was the only Indian at the end of World War I to actually sign the Treaty of Versailles, by which after the war ended, Indian princely armies fought in Africa, in Europe, during the Boxer Rebellion in China. So the Rajas were not to be written off, but they could never unite. They always had these petty issues that consumed them. For example, Nizam of Hyderabad would not come for Chamber of Princes meetings because he would think that, oh, these are petty Rajas. I am the last representative of the Mughals. I will not treat these chaps as my equals. The Rajput Rajas would not come because they did not like the Maratha rulers. They would say, why should I think of the Maratha as a fellow equal? So the princes somewhere got lost in this, and they were never able to get together and carve out a space for themselves, even when the opportunity came. And by the time they realized that it was getting late, global conditions and the overall picture had changed. After the Second World War, partition was looming. The huge part of India was going to be hacked off. Even the Congress, Gandhiji was very sympathetic to the princely states as late as 1935. He did not want Congress to meddle in princely politics, saying that it's like interfering in Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. He was extremely respectful. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who in 1949 would call the princely state ulcers that needed to be removed for the integrity of the nation. In 1929, in a speech in Mysore, he basically says the Mysore Raja is so great. If Mysore's people are still unhappy, there's something wrong with the people. He switched, those 20 years were critical. The whole public opinion, the mood, all of that has changed. And with partition looming, the princes started looking more and more petty. Their grievances, their issues were suddenly no longer the big thing at the table. After partition, the Congress was also determined that what remained of what would become the Indian Union had to be extremely strong. They would not allow loose entities and loose autonomous units existing in different places. They wanted to maintain the center strength, for which, again, the princes would have to go, which is why by the time the princes woke up and tried to negotiate a better deal, it was too late. They in 1947, they still managed to hold on to their states. They only gave up defense, foreign relations, and communications, telegraph, and this, that, to the government of India. Internally, they continued autonomous till 1949. But then Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel came with a stick and a carrot. Where the stick was needed, he used the stick. Where the carrot worked, he used the carrot. And that's how the princely states went. But yes, there was an opportunity in the 30s for the princely states to find a place for themselves in the Indian Union. They failed to take the opportunity. Otherwise, for all you know, I would not tell you today that I come from Kerala. I might still say I come from Travancore.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering.
Thank you, Jyotsna. That was a very interesting question and a very well-balanced and nuanced answer from Manu. Thank you. Manu, we will let you go very soon, but we have a very interesting question from Sandeep Dayal. Sandeep is a renowned branding expert and a cognitive science expert. He was a past guest on our webinar. So thank you, Sandeep, for coming back. And would you now ask your question to Manu?
Oh, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for this very interesting lecture. The question I think was partially answered. The question that I was going to ask was whether there was any degree of, so to speak, collaboration amongst the princely states, and I think you just commented on that. From the perspective of, us versus them relative to the British. And then more specifically, what was the relationship between the princely states and the British relative to collaborations on military actions? Were the princely states sort of contributing to the British military effort against other princely states, for example? So if you could just comment on those two things.
Yeah, I think, on the first part, that in fact, the princes were not supposed to coordinate with each other without the British in the picture. So, even if you look at the treaties the British signed with the Rajas, most of them say that any connection or any, diplomatic engagement you have with another state must be routed through the British. in practice, this was often flouted. People use their old cultural links, marriage alliances, etc., to stay in touch with each other. When Sayajirao Gaikwad of Baroda came to the throne in 1881, young boy of 18, it was his fellow Maratha ruler in Indore who basically secretly told him the British wanted to impose certain conditions on Sayajirao, saying that, oh, you're not experienced, so there'll be certain conditions for a certain period of time. And Sayajirao fought back, and the person advising him was the Maharaja of Indore, who was secretly in touch with him. So there was a sort of back channel that existed among the princes, and they were able to use that to their advantage, and the British were often very wary of it. In fact, in the World War, the First World War, the princes supported it, and the Maharaja of Bikaner actually expected the British to allow the princes a greater say in British ruled India. Sometimes the British needed it. For example, when the British wanted to build, I think, a dam or something on the Ganga, the congressmen at that time said, no, Ganga is a sacred river. You can't construct, you can't block it in any way. It was the princes that the British had to get to the table, because the princes had cultural authority. So you get a Brahmin Raja, you get a Maratha Raja, a Rajput Raja, all these Rajas of different backgrounds. And they negotiated with the congressman and managed to get his objection withdrawn and reached a compromise. So there was a kind of overlap even between princes participating in British Indian politics. On the question of the military is actually one of the more fascinating things, because yes, they participated in the world wars, for example. They gave a lot of money, and it wasn't money given because, I don't know, they thought, oh, we must contribute to this great war and defeat the Germans. No, their expectation was, if we give money, we're expecting something in return from the British, and the British did deliver. Interference in the princely states after this First World War reduced, because the Rajas had basically bargained for that. They basically paid and got back the privilege of greater autonomy in their internal affairs. So British agents in the courts were told, now back off a little bit. Yes, in the 19th century and early parts of the 19th century, various princely armies could support the East India Company against other princes. That certainly happened. In 1857 also, when the Great Rebellion broke out, many of the princely states sided with the British East India Company, because they realized that the way the cards were going to fall, the risk was higher if they sided with the Indians, and it was less risky to side with the East India Company. Another thing was some of them played a double game. So in both Indore, in Jaipur, etc., the Rajas officially said, yes, we side with the British, but somehow the Raja's army would rebel and go off with the Indians who were fighting on the other side. And the Raja would say, oops, I had no idea. In a sense, the British suspected the Raja was playing a game, that he was sitting on the fence, allowing his troops to fight with the rebels while himself siding with the British, and thereby protecting his interests, whichever way the war ultimately ended. So it's interesting that way. So initially, the British reduced the influence of the Raja's militaries. So in Travancore, it was disbanded by 1809, with the Scindias had an army of 45,000 troops even in the 1840s. After that, even I think that was disbanded after the war in 1843. But they were the last, I think, to have such a big army. But by the 1880s, with the so-called Great Game with Russia picking up between Britain and Russia about dominance in Central Asia and so on, the British started realizing that actually, if you allow the princes to maintain decent armies, it could be used for purposes of the empire. And there was a count done in 1881 where they, I think, said that the princely states altogether, with existing numbers, could contribute 300,000 soldiers to the British Indian Army if the need arose. So at that point, they started again allowing these princely armies to arm themselves, participate in some of these Western, military engagements in Africa, in other parts of the world, Mesopotamia, and so on and so forth, just to give them some practice. However, it was always made sure that the weapons given to the princely armies were a few grades lower than what the British Indian Army used. They could never exceed the British Army. Perhaps they could be trained to play a kind of subordinate role, but never get to a position where they could challenge the British directly. The only person who considered the possibility of them challenging the British directly and really asserting themselves was a man called V.D. Savarkar. Savarkar in the early 1940s wrote this very interesting op-ed in a newspaper where he said that if the princely armies unite and the king of Nepal emerges from the Himalayas with his armies and comes down to Delhi, the princely states can come together, they can declare India a Hindu empire and crown the king of Nepal as the emperor of India. It was a slightly weird dream that Savarkar had, but again, he was building on the fact that if the princes chose, they had the resources perhaps to, tilt the scale even in a military sense. But again, their armies were too scattered. It wasn't like all these troops were in one place, 3,000 in one state, 10,000 some other state, 5,000 in a third state. So it was too scattered. But even so, it was not a non-entity. They still had some military clout.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep, and good to see you again. Thanks for joining. One other interesting question. Manu, I know we are keeping you much longer, but we are almost there. Chandni Jaswal, you had a question. Chandni, you want to come on and ask your question?
Thank you, Ravi sir, and thank you to the university for conducting this lecture, and thank you, Manu sir, for this very enlightening talk. So my question was that did the royal families marry across culture, say the royal family in Patiala marrying into the royal family of Travancore, or were such intercultural alliances avoided to ensure that the culture and the sovereignty of the kingdom is preserved?
It's actually a great question, because it's such an interesting facet of princely politics, marriage, because a lot of politics was conducted through marriage. I'll give you one example. In Mysore, they're a South Indian family. They emerged from a local chieftain's clan. They were descended from that somewhere in the 15th century. But somewhere along the line, they started claiming that they were pristine Kshatriyas. And a lot like the Marathas claimed that they were descended from Rajputs, long-lost Rajputs. The Mysore Maharajas also decided overnight that they were going to claim to be Rajputs. So in the late 19th century, the Maharaja of Mysore decided he had to get his son and his daughters married to Rajputs. Now, embassy was sent to Rajputana. None of the Rajputs accepted it. They said, absolutely not. We will not accept you as an equal. If you want to give us a daughter, we will take your daughter, but we will never marry our daughters to you, because that is what really signifies equality. When a Rajput will give you a daughter is when you're acknowledged also as a Rajput. Now, the Mysore court was so disappointed and they were so determined that they should get a Rajput bride for their prince, that they went all over Rajputana. All the big states said no. Finally, they came to Gujarat, and there was a man they found called the Rana of Vana. Vana was this tiny state, some 30 square miles. So, practically just like a suburb in Bombay. And his revenue in a year, Mysore's revenue was in millions. This man's revenue was 30,000 rupees or something, 80,000 rupees or something like that. He finally agreed to give a daughter, and the Mysore royal family took it. They accepted the offer simply because, forget the girl's economic background, forget her father's lack of political status. She had the blood they needed, and therefore they got her there. Of course, unfortunately, she and the Raja did not have children. So the power passed to the Raja's brother's family, which was again fully Kannadiga and fully local. Again, in the next generation, they managed to get a Rajput woman. Rajput woman could not understand Kannada. She could not understand local culture. She went back to Rajputana, married a Kannada woman. Recently, there was a young man adopted into the family. He finally, again, married from a Rajput family from, I think, Dungarpur, which is a junior branch of Mewat, the highest of the Rajputs.
Yeah, that's Dungarpur.
They finally even have a son. So finally, the Mysore Vadiyars have a child of Rajput blood. But this whole question of marriage was always linked to ideas of caste and so on and so forth. I don't know, you may be too young to remember. Somewhere about 20 years ago, there was a big massacre in Nepal where the crown prince went and basically shot everybody in his family. And the story goes that, of course, he had issues, mental health issues. But apparently the trigger was that he was in love with a lady, and his family refused to get her married to him simply because she had Maratha blood in her. And they said she's not a clean, full Rajput, therefore we can't allow her to marry. So this politics of marriage affected something as recent as the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it was a big part of the princely states.
So, sir, the marriage between the royal house of Jaipur and the Kuch Behar family is an exception to the royal family politics?
That marriage was looked down on. The reason the Maharaja's court accepted it was the Maharaja had already married 2 Rajput women. He had already produced heirs to the throne. So a third Maharani from a different background, frankly, made no difference to them, because she was, it was like an extra thing on the side, not something that would affect the Rajput lineage that was already settled by them. So I think that was the reason he was able to go ahead with it. In a lot of other states, of course, even Kuch Behar marrying the Maratha princess of Baroda, which was this Gayatri Devi's mother, for example, her family didn't like it because they thought Kuch Behar was lower in status. She threatened to run away and create a public scandal. That's when they said, okay, fine, go do what you want. And they basically cut her off for a long time. But there were marriages that were arranged, but they were usually within the same communities and within a general geography where the communities, where the families recognize themselves as political equals. Then there was a kind of possibility of giving and taking spouses, but otherwise it was not quite as clean cut. Sometimes, again, I'm giving a very long-winded answer, but you also find intra-caste dynamics. So both the Gaikwads of Baroda and the Scindias of Gwalior, they were Marathas, but of, let's say, a lesser prominence. Their families all rose to prominence in the 18th century, before which they were ordinary village heads. The story goes one of them was a slipper carrier, the other used to take care of the cowshed and so on. These are apocryphal, but the point is that they were of modest background. But having achieved power, in order to improve their own bloodline, they started looking for other Maratha families that had a much more pristine pedigree and married women from those families. So the women brought good blood to the table, the husbands brought power to the table, and the next generation was, in quotes, purified. So that's how, for example, Jamna Bai, the daughter of a village headman in Rahimatpur, was married to the Maharaja of Baroda. It didn't matter that she was a village headman's daughter. She had the right blood. It's how Baiza Bai married the Maharaja Scindia of Gwalior, because she belonged to a family that was aristocratic from the time of the Deccan Sultanates in the 16th century, whereas his family was only 18th century. But again, he had power, she had the bloodline. So again, the intra-caste, the inter-caste, all of this is quite interesting.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Chandni. That was very interesting. And Manu, this is amazing how, in response to every question, you are able to pull out such specific anecdotes and stories.
I feel a bit embarrassed because clearly I'm talking far too much. I'm supposed to give crisp and
but
short
Manu,
answers.
No, but those stories is what brings the answers to life. We can visualize from your anecdotes and stories. So we've kept you far too long, so I'll not talk anymore. So I'll hand you back to Tana to give her closing remarks and bring the webinar to a close. Tana?
Right. Thank you so much, Ravi. In fact, this is exactly what I was going to say, that the kind of energy and the kind of enthusiasm that you bring, Manu, is exactly what we need in the classrooms, also for young historians like you to engage with the audiences, because, answering, a question which was asked about how does one make history interesting? This is exactly how we make history so interesting. So thank you so much for being with us today. I know we've visibly exhausted you with all our questions.
No, that wasn't because of the questions, because I'm, as I said, finishing my thesis. It's due in the next 2 months. So I'm extremely sleep deprived. That's the only reason I look tired and haggard. Nothing to do with your questions. And thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everybody else who asked the questions as well after the main discussion was over. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found, at least, as I said, if it provokes a few questions, that's something positive achieved. And I hope you'll read the book and find that interesting as well.
Absolutely, Manu. In fact, we look forward to even hosting you at Ahmedabad University. Maybe once you need to take a little break from your writing and you need a change of place, you're very welcome to.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
We'd love to host you here. So, yes. But I'm hoping you'll be in Pune for a few more months.
Yeah, I think so. At least till August. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here today. Absolutely brilliant conversation. Thank you, Manu.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Thank you. And to the audience, we'll see you again in a couple of weeks with another interview.